It was fascinating to hear her presentation. I actually just happened to be reading her book. I didn't even know she was preceding me, and so it was great to see her present. We will make ours pretty quick and move fluidly because I know we have another panel that is starting at 11:15. My name is Dietrich Asante Mohammed. I just started a few weeks ago at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition as their Chief of Equity and Inclusion. Previous to that, I was at Prosperity Now. I was founder, director of the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, and used to come to these sessions a decent amount when I worked for Reverend Al Sharpton, who I know is here, and used to run his National Crisis Center in New York. So it's good to be back. What I'm going to do is I will quickly have each of the panelists introduce themselves, introduce a little bit of the work they do. I think this is going to be a very good follow-up session to the previous session. We're going to talk more about, what can we do about the depth of racial wealth inequality. I'll talk a little bit about it, about the reality of racial wealth inequality today, but just a few minutes. I think a lot of you have heard this type of information. And then we're really going to dive into representing two different organizations and an esteemed scholar, what type of work on the ground is happening to address this issue. So first, let's start with my friend Marvin. Why don't you introduce yourself and the work you do?
Thanks, Dietrich. Marvin Owens. I'm Senior Director for Economic Programs at the NAACP. I manage all of our national economic programs. As you all know, that the NAACP will be celebrating 110 years this year of existence, and looking forward to the conversation. I can't say enough about that preceding presentation. I think she set the table perfectly for us.
She did.
Yeah.
Very good. Professor?
Yes, Tyrone Williams. I'm the provost at Rutgers University, Newark, and by training I'm a social psychologist, so I conduct experiments, and primarily I focus on the marketplace, inequality in the marketplace, both in the consumer level and at the small business level. So we try to measure and detect discrimination when it occurs in lending, and consumer racial profiling when people go into stores, and that's basically, and we have a book out called Race in the American Marketplace.
Great. Thank you, sir. And Sabrina?
Hi, Sabrina Terry. I'm a senior program manager at Unidos US. Unidos US was formerly known as the National Council of La Raza. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, great. So formerly known as the National Council of La Raza, we are the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. We have nearly 300 affiliates, which are community-based nonprofit organizations that provide direct services to communities of color, primarily Latino communities. And we work with them and engage with them on policy and advocacy issues, as well as programmatic interventions that we believe can provide opportunities and uplift Latino families across the country, as well as similarly situated communities. I work on economic policy, focusing on economic policy, asset development, asset building for low-income Latinos, immigrant families, and low-wealth families.
Great, thank you, and I thank you all for coming to do this panel. And I'm just going to start off a little bit, because I think it's been talked about a lot at the conference. There's been a lot of conversation about racial wealth inequality and the reality of racial wealth inequality. And, I always just like to highlight, and I think this is, I've got a lot of this from studying people like Reverend Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, about looking at racial inequality, the foundation of racial inequality, right? Because so oftentimes when we talk about race, we talk about it in personal relations, but as this conference has been talking about, the foundation of racial inequality isn't people having bad relations with another people. The foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, right? It wasn't that Europeans didn't get along well with Africans. It was they wanted them for their labor, right? And so there was an economic drive of this inequality. And then I like to add to that, the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, but the foundation of racial economic inequality is racial wealth inequality, right? And I think that's why we're talking so much about wealth inequality. And just to highlight, this numbers might have already been shown, but I just want everyone to be clear about where we are with wealth inequality, right? Blacks make about 60 cents on every dollar that whites make in terms of income, but in terms of wealth, blacks only make about 2 cents, or only have 2 cents on every dollar of wealth that whites have. And you can see that this is not something that's been bridging. The most recent data we have, 2016, whites have about $150,000 in median wealth. Depends how you measure it, but the measure we're using, not including like your car and these types of things, median wealth for whites is $150,000. Median wealth for blacks is $3,600, right? That's the median household wealth. For Latinos, it's a little over $6,000. And so you can understand that if you have a median wealth of $3,000, that's not going to do very much for you, right? Because again, the importance of wealth over income is wealth is what allows you to take advantage of economic opportunities. It allows you to maybe send someone to a program so they can do better in their job or go to college or buy a home or start a small business. It also allows you to deal with challenges, economic challenges in the road, right? Which is why when there's a recession, it's oftentimes a depression for Black America because you only have $3,600 stored away, and that includes equity in your home. Then you lose your job for a couple months, which African Americans are more likely to do, and lose it for a longer period of time. You're not just hitting a bump, you're hitting like a mountain, and you end up losing your house, foreclosure. So it's this depth of racial wealth inequality that's such a challenge. And I would just say two more things, and then I'll get to the panel. But again, I just want to highlight the difference between income and wealth, because too oftentimes we think about, well, you know, if you're high income, if you're median income, you're doing all right. Or actually the opposite. I talk a lot to nonprofits, and they're like, well, I deal with poor people, and all poor people are the same. As this slide highlights, those who make less than around $18,420, the median wealth for whites is $3,000. That's not a lot of money. But for Blacks and Latinos, the median wealth is $0, right? You're in a different economic position. If you're making household less than $18,500, you have zero in wealth. And I think oftentimes the problem with our government programs or private programs is the programs aren't designed to deal with our economic needs. They say you're low income, median income, high income, and if you're in this box, and this is how you move forward. But they don't deal with the fact that even if we're middle income or higher income, we have radically different wealth than whites. And so we need a different type of economic program in order to move us forward and help strengthen financial security. And then just the only other thing I'll highlight too is oftentimes people confuse education and wealth, right? And this data point here highlights how the median wealth for whites, you see there with a high school diploma, GED, is around $64,000. That's almost twice the median wealth of Blacks with a 4-year degree, or Latinos with a 4-year degree. So even your educational status doesn't bridge the racial wealth divide. As the last speaker was saying, the only thing that's going to bridge the racial wealth divide is wealth itself. Its capital has to be invested in our communities. But I want to now take this to the panel, and I'm going to, the first question I'm going to put forward is, in what ways do you see racial wealth inequality reflected in the work you do, and what type of programs you see on the ground are trying to address this issue? And I'll start off with Sabrina and then go on down.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dietrich, for teeing that up. So, I think that the last presenter and Dietrich really talked a lot about some of the historical context that has led to the racial wealth divide that we see today. And I think that's really important to highlight, just because there's a lot of rhetoric out there about how, we've had the civil rights movement, we had affirmative action, we had our first Black president, what else is there to really focus on? And I think that there's this huge misconception that, somehow all of this inequality is somehow going to magically go away, when actually it's compounding. It's compounding, and it's becoming worse and worse. And I think that's something that we really need to underscore. At Unidos US, we've been doing a lot of work focusing on 10 years in the rear, looking at 10 years since the recession and how that has impacted Latinos and where we are today. And I could tell you that, much like the African American community, the Latino community, a lot of our wealth was lost in the Great Recession. The Latinos saw a 42% decline in their wealth between 2007 and 2014.
And they didn't have much to begin with. I mean,
Exactly.
you only had around $8,000
Right,
or what have you.
Right. So even the nominal wealth that Latino and Black families were able to secure, let's say over the last 30 years, was really wiped out in the recession. So it's really important to understand that these issues didn't start with the recession, but they got worse with the recession. And so when we look at the 10-year look back, there are two main areas that we see that there's still a persistent gap where we haven't even been able to reach pre-recession levels. And so for us in the Latino community, and I think you could say the same for the Black community, you could see it in our housing and our home ownership, as well as our retirement savings, which are the two largest ways that people of color actually build wealth and try to actually pass something on. And so for Latinos, because our wealth was so closely tied to housing, when the market crashed, so did the little wealth that we did have. And we have still yet to been able to reach our homeownership levels. We are still confronting foreclosure, we're still confronting debt, and limited opportunities for actual home ownership. And so because homeownership is out of reach for many Latinos right now, they're being driven into a high-cost rental market, where especially in urban centers. So right now in 2017, 55% of Latinos devote more than 30% of their income to rent, meaning that, and then it increases by even more if you think about those who are paying over 50% in rent. So if you're paying more and more in rent, it's harder to save to eventually reach home ownership. It's harder to build a nest egg. It's harder to even direct anything over to retirement savings. And so at Unidos US, one of the policy priorities that we have is, one, we would like to see a reinvestment in the Housing Trust Fund, not just for affordable homes for ownership, but also for affordable rentals. We also believe that there needs to be a rent-burdened tax credit. So households who are paying more than 30% in their income on rent need to receive a tax credit at tax time so that they can receive something back and put that away and redirect it into assets.
Great,
So,
and let's hold off on the policy to the
I'm
later
sorry.
part.
Okay,
Sorry,
I'm
go
jumping the
ahead.
gun, y'all. I'm sorry. Okay, anyway. And then in terms of retirement, across the country, we see that more than 2/3 of Latinos have no retirement savings at all. And this is in comparison to 39% of white households. So there's definitely a discrepancy there. This is in large part due to the type of employment that Latinos, and I would say a lot of African Americans currently have, where they're in low-wage jobs, non-livable wage jobs, where it's really hard for them to tuck away money to put towards retirement. And they're also in employment where their employers do not provide an employer-sponsored retirement plan, meaning that they're not being offered a 401k at work. They're not being offered, retirement investments as a part of their package. And so they're starting at zero. They're not, unless they're able to put it away themselves, they're not having any type of incentive or support in building that retirement nest egg.
And I just want to pause on that note, because I think it is really interesting to highlight how we subsidize retirement for median and high income earners. But for those who have the hardest time saving, we oftentimes don't provide any type of 3% matching, 5% matching, maybe not even offer a 401k plan at all for those who are most in need of it, right? So again, it's not...
That contributes to the wealth gap.
It absolutely
Right.
contributes to the wealth gap. And, and that's why, we have this ongoing racial wealth divide, because we invest in wealth for the wealthiest, and we don't invest in lower wealth people. But sorry, Sabrina, go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you for underscoring that. And so I think one of the other priorities that we have at Unidos US, which may not seem as directly related to wealth building, but when you really start to peel it back, I think that you could see the connection, which is paid sick leave and paid family leave. I think there's often a misconception about how the middle class was built within the United States and the type of support that they received. But you'll see that that middle class, they have been able to secure jobs where they actually have paid time off, paid sick leave, so that if they have to take time off of work, they are still getting paid so that they can take care of an elder, they can take care of a child. If they're sick, they can still get paid and recover and return to work. But unfortunately for many low-income households and low-wealth households, that's just not a reality. When they're taking time off of work, they are taking a pay hit. And as you know, we live in intergenerational households, so we are often taking care of our elders. And so at Unidos US, we believe that there needs to be, there needs to be some addressing of that issue, that disparity between Latino and African American households who have less access to paid family leave and paid sick leave.
Great. Thank you, Sabrina. Let's hear from Professor.
Yeah. So what I do as a social scientist is we study the marketplace, particularly the banking industry. So if we assume, and I think it's a valid assumption, and one of the ways through wealth is entrepreneurship, that is owning a business, and most of the businesses in the United States are small businesses, and there are many businesses owned by African Americans and Latinos, and so what we measure is the playing field level. So we have done what we call a triad of testers. We will get an African American tester, a white tester, and a Latino tester, and we'll give them the same profile. And we'll send them out to different banks around the country. We ask them to apply for a loan. And we measure concrete things like how many years of tax returns are they asking for, other types of qualifications that may be required. And what we've seen in a series of studies going back several years is that there's a disparity there. And so when you have this unequal playing field, it's not level, if you're trying to seek wealth through entrepreneurship, the deck is already stacked against you, as we know, but we haven't really had the concrete evidence to really show it. And it's not only in the types of things that we've measured, and we've published this in academic journals, but also in qualitative things. For example, you've probably heard a lot about implicit bias today, the way people make assumptions. And so we've been able to detect the fact that if it's a person of color sitting across the desk who's applying for a loan, they're even through some of the qualitative measures that we've looked at that involve implicit bias, as how friendly, because we videotaped many of these interactions, and we brought people in to assess what do you see going on here in this interaction. So one of the things that, and we won't get into the policy aspect right now, but one of the things we like to see would help is to get the playing field level so that if you are seeking more wealth through entrepreneurship, at least the playing field is level.
Well, and I appreciate, Professor Williams, your comments, because, too, you're highlighting that not only are we dealing with the racial wealth divide, but then you're dealing with racial bias on top of that,
Yeah.
right? It'd be hard enough if there was no bias,
Right.
and we had this wealth division. Also, I like these two comments, and I know Marvin's going to add more, but I love this broadening the understanding of racial wealth inequality, right? It's not one thing, right? It's not just home ownership. It's not just savings. It's not just the way we subsidize higher and middle income for retirement. It's all these things together. And so in order to address the racial wealth divide, we're not going to have one policy. We have to have a host of policies, right? And again, as Sabrina mentioned, if you understand how the white middle class was created, it wasn't one policy. It was massive investment. It was subsidies in home ownership, subsidies in higher education, mass employment, right? They estimated they put more money in creating the white middle class than they did in rebuilding Europe after World War II. But it was just for the white middle class. So it's going to have to be a comprehensive effort in order to address the racial wealth divide. And so I'd love to hear from Marvin about what how the NAACP is moving, dealing with some of these issues.
Yeah, I'm going to expand it even further,
Yes,
because
sir.
3 years ago, when I came to the NAACP, the leadership was running around the country responding to all the police killings.
Yes, sir.
And so we had the list is long, and you all have heard the names many, many times. And so the focus of attention nationally was really on police and community, and how police and community were interacting and what had to be done about that. So when I came into the NAACP, I drove us to ask a different question, which is not just the conversation about police and community, but what is sort of creating the genesis of the violence. And what we did was we did some in-depth studies in each one of these cities: Baltimore, Charlotte, Ferguson, St. Louis, and what we highlighted was the fact that violence on the street had its genesis in decades of economic discrimination.
Yes, sir.
So when you talk about the violence that's happening, don't just look at the fact that folks are angry on the street, but understand the fact that anger is being birthed out of economic discrimination. So when you look at lack of investment in schools, when you look at where industry is located, the lack of access to jobs, all the sort of broader lack of investment feed the violence that's on the ground. And so we call the report the Minority Report, kind of playing off that movie that was out, that you can predict where stuff is about to happen.
Yes,
based
sir.
on the data. You can predict where it's going to happen, because when you get the lack of investment in these places, then of course that's a place where you can expect where folks will get frustrated at some point, and something happens, and then the place explodes. Well, the NAACP began to sort of look at more deeply our economic programs, because we had been doing the kind of work. I mean, Dietrich, you were part of that, where we were working with banks and lending institutions about trying to do financial education and homeownership education programs and all this great stuff. But we were not ever addressing the fact that we were not going to close this wealth gap trying to get more jobs for people. You don't close the wealth gap with jobs. You don't close the wealth gap just with creating more home ownership. That does help. It's great to do it. It will benefit our communities. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but the reality is, if we're not seriously talking about things like reparations, then we're never going to close the wealth gap. And so the conversation that our national organizations need to kind of get the courage to have is that we need to put this on the table. Now, as you heard just a little while ago, that it's now becoming a common conversation among leading economists that this is not a crazy idea. Mm-hmm. So I think what I've been pushing internally at the NAACP is we have to put this back on the table. Because we can have all the great programs about entrepreneurship and home ownership education, and try to do all this great work, and we'll make some progress. But if we are not talking about reparations, then we are never going to close that gap.
Well, and I just want to add to that. I think it's an important piece. And I think most of the people I know who seriously study the racial wealth divide, Derek Hamilton, even Mariko Chang, various people, all understand reparations needs to be a part of it. But I just want to highlight, you're talking about the great work being done around entrepreneurship and these types of things. I would just critique, we haven't even made advances in entrepreneurship or even in employment, right? 1963 March on Washington, African Americans had half the unemployment rate, or blacks had twice the unemployment rate of whites. And in today, blacks have twice the unemployment rate of whites, right? So it's like, we need to move so far, and that's why reparations has to be comprehensive. But I really do appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit about, because I think there is more conversation now than ever before in mainstream politics, right? I think we've had conversations in our communities about these issues for a long time. But in mainstream politics, there's more of a conversation addressing some of these issues. And I would love to hear from the panel, what promising policies they see that are being discussed and how you'd want to move the discussion. So let's start backwards. Let's start with Marvin, and then we'll come back down.
One of the things that we're doing at the NAACP, and we're excited about this, is that we have been really focused in on, this is called the Wall Street Project here, this conference. The NAACP will be at the New York Stock Exchange on next Tuesday, and we'll be ringing the closing bell and bringing attention to an NAACP branded ETF, which is an exchange traded fund. So basically, the NAACP has taken a model that we used to do for decades called the corporate scorecard, where we would engage corporations in conversation around their commitment to certain kinds of diversity, supplier diversity, board diversity, black folks in C-suites, kind of the list of things that we'd measure them on, and then grade them and publish that grade, and basically shame the corporation into doing the right thing. We took that model and applied it to companies on the S&P 500. So publicly traded companies at $2 billion or more capitalization on the S&P 500, we applied that model to them, created an index. So all the companies in the NAACP ETF have been scored and ranked by the NAACP and said, here are the companies that are trying to do the right thing. Now all these companies are not all doing everything right.
Yes.
They're great, they're scores. But what it does is, what we're drawing attention to is the power of the private sector to drive policy change. I sit around these tables and all the conversations with these corporations all the time about what they're doing internally, and we hear that. Remember, years ago, $15 an hour minimum wage was like heresy. Folks were angry. We could never do that. We can't afford it. But when Bank of America comes out and says we're going to pay everybody $15 an hour, that changes the public discourse around whether that's a good policy or not.
Yes.
These private corporations have a lot of power to impact what happens in public policy. So part of what we've been doing at the NAACP is making sure that we're leveraging those private relationships and saying, you all need to be doing more. Because they can drive the conversation like nobody else can. Because if we're in this time where free market capitalism is the golden thing that everybody loves and talk about, then private companies then have a much more of a leadership role to play in driving these social issues. Now listen, they're not going to do this because it's the right thing to do. They're only going to do it because it makes financial sense to them. So what we've been able to do is to remind them that committing themselves to investing in our communities, to working and partnering with us, is good business. We're not asking you to, it's not just asking for a handout, or we're trying to get you to, it is a philanthropic kind of thing. But they have come to understand that diversity and inclusion is a good business model. So all the companies are moving in that direction, and we're now using that as a way to kind of leverage that energy to kind of create access. $3 trillion are being invested around this country, traded in this country in the capital markets. Less than 1% is managed by people of color. Less than 1%.
I believe Mr. Rogers is doing a panel after this, and one of the important things he said that blows my mind is he was talking about growing up in Chicago and how he saw these kids practicing, basketball, wanting to be basketball stars, and we all know how hard that is. But he said when he did the data analysis, he said it's more likely for a black kid in Chicago, poor black kid in Chicago, to be in the NBA than to be a leading trader on stock markets. And I was like, that's kind of crazy about how much. I mean, we don't know how hard it is to get in the NBA, and it's even harder, or less likely for poor black kids to make it into this finance world. So I'm really glad you guys are kind of pushing the doors on that. Yeah, very good. Professor, you want to talk to us about what type of policies you see? And actually, I think we're moving fast enough that I might be able to take one or two questions from the crowd. So, but Professor, if you want to talk a little bit about policies you think are out there or need to be discussed more to address these issues.
Right. Yeah, so I take kind of a narrow focus on race and how this is used in making decisions, particularly for entrepreneurs. And one of the things that we're trying to do now is to look at all the studies that have been done, because most of the time we don't capture that race in the situation of when decisions are being made and who gets the loan and who doesn't get the loan. It's very easy to go back and collect data and say, after the decision has been made. So one of the concepts that we're looking at now, from a standpoint of looking at analyzing race is called algorithmic justice, which basically says, what is the algorithm that's being used to make these decisions, who gets the loan and who doesn't get the loan, and how does race play into that? And we know now, if we look across a whole realm of areas, that race can factor into something that you don't always realize that it's in there. Like some of the cases we've looked at, let's say, a bed and breakfast, and you can go online and you put in when you want to stay and so forth. Well, there are certain questions that can be teased out and kind of determine race without asking what race is. Yeah. And then eventually you find out that if you're an African American or Latino, you're not getting the same options of applying and getting accepted at a bed and breakfast as a white person. And so we're trying to look at what we call algorithmic justice to rectify that. And the same thing can happen in banking. And so one of the policies is we could capture, be required to have information on race of the applicant when applying for a loan. Now, there's a counter argument to that, and some have argued that, well, this just imposes another layer of paperwork, and that would really add to the cost and so forth. So those are the things that you've got to weigh, and so we're.
But I would put forward, Professor, that the cost of not getting that data and continuing kind of the racial economic inequality we've been having for so long is even worse.
Yeah.
And it's not usually factored in.
And that's the point we're trying to make, that, okay, if you don't have the data, look what's happening in the marketplace through the studies that we're doing. So we really have to move in that direction. Yeah.
Great, no, thank you. And again, I think so much of it is about counting prevailing narratives, right? Because again, people like to say in terms of race that we're not where we want to be, but we're getting there. But if you look at the economic numbers, we're not getting there. It's getting worse. We're on a path to ongoing racial apartheid, economic apartheid in this country as blacks and Latino population gets bigger and bigger, which means it'll have a bigger effect on the American economy. But let me take this to Sabrina Terry from Unidos US to tell us about some of the policies they see on the horizon or they're interested in advancing.
Yeah, so at Unidos US, as I mentioned before, we support policies that we believe are going to help build a middle class, that is going to help Latinos and other communities build wealth. And so things that we have seen historically that have actually helped the white middle class grow, we're asking for the same things. We are demanding the same things, and we don't think that it's much to ask. It's unpatriotic to ask just because we're still fighting for them. And so, as I mentioned, we definitely are focused on affordable home ownership through the investment of the Housing Trust Fund, as well as a rent burden tax credit to go to any household that's paying more than 30% on rent. But we also have policies that we believe is going to disrupt the workplace setting and is going to attack some of the companies that my colleague mentioned, right? So when you look at the civil rights movement, there was definitely the groundswell of like community mobilization, community support, like that social mobilization that really pushed the needle, but that was also met with policy changes as well. And so we want to also make sure that we're requesting specific things from these companies. So when we talk about, workplace retirement savings, we do feel like there should be federal legislation that mandates that all employers actually provide employees some form of employer retirement savings, whether they do it through, the private channels that are available or through some of these burgeoning state plans that are taking place like Cal Savers. We feel like those types of plans can be replicated and can really make a difference in helping low wealth communities of color actually build their retirement nest egg. Similarly, we're asking for federal legislation on paid family leave, paid sick leave, so that when a person of color has to take time off of work, that it's not going to be detrimental to their financial security. These are things that we really believe can be transformational for communities of color, because it's really going to hit not only the small employers, right, which is what some of the conservatives would like to say, like, oh, you're trying to put entrepreneurs out of business by requiring these things. But if you really look at who's employing people of color, if you really look, it's these big box stores. they like roughly half of like low income people of color work for these big box retailers, Walmart, Target, those types of places. So when we talk about this federal legislation and these workplace policies that we want to see on the federal level, that's where it's really going to move the needle in terms of workplace settings. And so that's really what we're focused on at Unidos US, in addition to other things that, like an estate tax, reinstating an estate tax to heirs, so people who are going to be receiving 20 million or more in inheritance, taxing them so that we can redirect some of that money into programs such as these. So that's where we're at.
Great, great. And I see there's a question or two, so I will take that. And I think, too, it's just important when we talk about racial wealth inequality and assets, it's not just, again, how much money you have in your bank or the equity in your home. Having a job with health insurance, that's a really important asset. That's an aspect of wealth. Having sick days, that's an asset, that's a wealth. And so a lot of us, when we think about wealth, we want to think about if you have a mansion. Think about where you are and what an increase of wealth is. That's having an extra $500 in savings, that's great. If that's getting a job that has health insurance, then that's another wealth building step you need to take. And we need to have a pathway that can really develop wealth for our community that's never been majority middle class in terms of wealth. So let me start with, and let's just have, because I have like 5 minutes, so let's just have quick questions. Let me start with Queen Mother Blakely.
Yes, thank you. I'm Queen Mother Blakely. I carry the legacy of Queen Mother Moore. You mentioned the word reparations, and it behooves the NACP to have Queen Mother Blakely a part of that in the spirit of Queen Mother Moore. I am on Wall Street, and the reason why, because
There's a
Judge
microphone,
William
Queen Mother.
Booth was.
There's a microphone. Right
Oh,
there.
thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Judge William Booth started my organization with me on Wall Street, 65 Liberty, the New York Chamber of Commerce. And since that time, with Queen Mother Moore, been fighting for reparation. And she says, children, go get your money. Don't talk about it, but go get it, okay? So what have happened to me over those years after she became an ancestor, a great teacher, agitate. So I agitated the United Nations. We now
Queen
have,
Mother, Queen Mother,
yes.
I don't mean to rush you, but I do have to. If you could wrap up in 30 seconds, okay?
Okay,
Yes,
in
ma'am.
30
Thank you.
seconds, going to be very difficult to do that.
Yes, ma'am.
But I want to leave in your heart reparation from Queen Mother Audley Moore, who carried it for 81 years. And I asked to be on Wall Street with you all when you do what you're going to do.
Okay.
And if
Thank you.
not, then Queen Mother going to go anyway to Wall Street on behalf of Queen Mother Moore. Thank you.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Gotcha.
And if people
Thank
aren't
you.
familiar with Queen Mother Moore, please do Google that name. It is a very important historic name. Right here, there's a question. Right here. Oh, yes, sir.
Yes.
And we'll take these two questions. Why don't you put both questions forward, and then the panel will answer them, then we can end. Yes,
Very
sir.
quick, want to commend all of you on the work that you're doing. Mr. Mohammed, it's a pleasure to meet you in person. I actually emailed you last year in March, so it's a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, yes, sir.
And we'll have a conversation. I hear the message on reparations. You can look up U.S. national debt clock. Just have something real interesting. $22 trillion deficit we have, $72 trillion U.S. total debt. U.S. unfunded liabilities, $122 trillion. My only question is, if we're ever going to get the reparations with all the amount of debt that we have in place,
Yes, sir. How
What-
does that work?
yes, I
Yes,
mean
sir.
with the amount of debt that is outstanding, where would those reparations come from?
Yes, sir. I'll take this question, then we'll have some final comments from the panel.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a Vietnam veteran
Yes, sir.
and a Marine. And when I came back from Vietnam, most white veterans had already been getting their pay from coming from Vietnam.
Yes, sir.
We had to fight hard to attempt to get paid. Now, you know how difficult it's got to be for us to try to become homeowners.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the same problems, and there's no concern about Vietnam veterans. Very few of us even knew about the opportunity for payment coming back.
Well-
We had to find that out from other white veterans.
Yes, sir. No, I think
That's
you,
how I found
and
it.
I think you bring up a really important point that
Okay.
the most promising aspect of veteran subsidies for home ownership
Mm-hmm.
happened when our armed forces were the whitest. And as blacks started getting more integrated, there was less and less focus on these programs. So black veterans never got to benefit the same way white veterans did.
So we are attempting now to fight about that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You know, if we didn't get the money coming from Vietnam, we're not getting any assistance to become homeowners or business leaders. And that's what we're trying to do in Chicago.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, and let's have a panel. Everybody can have a minute to respond, and then we'll close up, and we'll get to
I just
hear
want to quickly
Mr.
respond
Rogers.
to your point. I think it's an excellent point, but there's been a lot of new research and conversations around the true cost of economic discrimination. So even as you think about the sort of debt that's being created by really bad public policy that you see right now, and then this last tax bill was terrible policy. But the fact is, there are now more scholars looking at the cost of prolonged economic discrimination. So enlarging the wealth gap is not going to work well in the long term. So economists are now looking at the fact that if we in order to kind of have a solid, long, strong economy, you're going to have to look at how do you close these gaps. So now the conversation is not just about the fact that the debt is increasing, but but economic discrimination is contributing to that debt.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Professor Williams,
Yeah.
closing
Yeah,
comments.
I would just add that in addition to entrepreneurship as a way to wealth, as a professor and academic, I also feel strongly education is too. So we've done a lot of work in that, and I regret to say that I see the same problems in our universities and colleges where we have not offered the same opportunities. You know, I was a product of the '60s when I first went to school, and I remember coming out with my PhD in the '80s and being the only one in the whole country that got a PhD in my particular field, and the same was true with many other fields. Now, we've come a long way, but as one of the comments made, for every 2 steps forward, we've gone 1 step backward. So there are a lot of policies that I'm working on in terms of opening up the doors educationally for persons of color.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Great. And so
Sure.
my response to the gentleman right here is that, you know, initially when I've heard that question in the past, I've always said, well, there's a population of people who are not being taxed equitably. Let's just redirect that money. That has always been my response. But after the former presenter that was up here before us, you know, she mentioned like these securities that the Federal Reserve Bank has and they have been sitting on and that they could leverage to really address the idea of where the money for reparations is going to come from. And I thought that was really eye-opening. I can't endorse it completely because I haven't really researched it, but I think that that's another route that we should
She
consider.
noticed a couple $1 trillion, right? That
Right,
was used to
right.
bail out the banks.
Right.
No one was concerned.
Yeah.
No one was concerned about the deficit then, right? Or the tax cut.
The tax cut, right?
Right, which is like I said,
care
be a
less about the
trillion, you know, or the ongoing war in Afghanistan. I just make sure we don't balance the deficit on us,
Right.
right? Because now we got to balance the deficit when it starts coming to dealing with the racial wealth divide. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut
and
you off.
I guess I just want to also just piggyback on my colleague when talking about education. I think that's another pending issue that we have within communities of color, the student debt crisis. As you know, as low wealth families, students of color are taking on more debt to finance their education, but they're at higher rates of default because upon graduating college, if they are able to graduate, they're not getting the same employment opportunities as their white counterparts. They're not able to pay that back. Their parents are taking out loans just to finance the education. So what we see is a growing bubble of like a growing debt bubble over households of color without the economic means or the economic opportunities that should be met to actually pay off that debt. And so at Unidos US, we're really concerned about predatory lending in the student lending market, not necessarily just saying that, you know, and balancing that, right? Because we want to have families be able to finance their education, but we want to make sure that those loans are actually commensurate with the type of earning potential that that person is going to receive post-graduation. So just making sure that it's a balance in that way. And also the student servicing or student loan servicing market is atrocious. There's so much predatory things happening right now in student loan servicing, and the way they're lying to students, telling them that they're involved in loan forgiveness programs, and they're not. It's just running a gamut. So that's definitely an issue on the horizon that we see. And, you know, we have the communities with all the youth. You know, our communities are like majority, young population. So that's something that we really need to focus on moving forward.
Yeah, and let me just highlight, too, with the student debt piece, I think one of the things we oftentimes forget about is what really kills us with student debt is when we're not graduating. or when
Right.
we're getting degrees that really do nothing for us, right? And like that's what kills our community is people. I worked at a black college for a while. Kids are really working and going to school part-time. Really, that's what they're doing, but they're supposed to be going full-time. Then they end up dropping out in a couple of years because they realize they need to make some money for their family. So then they have, it might be a little bit of debt, 10,000, but they have no degree, right? And so that's just really wiping us out. I want to thank you all. I want to thank the panel for, even though we started 20 minutes late, we're ending on time, and I think we had some good information. So thank you all. Look forward to the next presentation.